failure doesn't really exist
Hmm.
because every person I've talked to has gone on from that failure. No one is still unemployed 8, 10, 12 months later. None of them just stayed on the ground. They all picked themselves up. They went to something else. And in many cases, that apparent failure set them up for later success. All right, Eric, welcome to the podcast. How are you this morning?
I'm doing well, Todd. Thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure. So we've got a lot of stuff to talk about today as it pertains to leadership, and you've got a new book that has come out recently, which we'll get to. But let's start with this. I read a statement that you made that every business problem you're facing is a people problem. How is that? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so every construction company has three fundamental things that they need to do. They got to get work, they've got to build work, and then they've got to get paid. So from a big 30,000 foot level, every construction company does that. In addition to that, they've got to do it if they're going to be profitable with the right client, with the right job in the right location. Having said all of that, you can have the best equipment, you can have the best processes and the best technology in the world, but if you don't have the right people in the right positions, you're not going to make money and you're not going to have long-term success. So the biggest challenge that contractors have is executing in those areas: get work, build work, get paid. And ultimately, those things are driven by people. So if you have problems in any one of those areas that you have control over, obviously there's problems outside of your business that you don't have control over, such as the greater economy. And typically, most of those problems are driven at some level by the people that you have in your organization.
What are some symptoms that a business owner has people problems? Maybe they have people problems that are masquerading as something else. But what are some of those symptoms that these problems that they're dealing with may actually be people problems?
Yeah. So when it comes to people, every company has to do three things with their people. First, they have to attract, then they have to develop, and then they have to retain. And when I think about attracting people to your organization, I think about it from a marketing perspective. And let me tell you what I mean. The best marketing, it does two things. It attracts your target audience and it repels the people that you don't want to work for you. And the problem with a lot of construction companies that causes the people problems is because they're not clear on things like their values and the way they want their people to behave in addition to their technical skills. They just bring in people who know how to build or perhaps are warm bodies, but they're not a fit culturally for the organization. So I'll give you an example. I have a client whose the purpose of their business is to crush the competition. And so they're really competitive guys. They're great guys, but they're super competitive. So if you're going to work there, you're going to be at your desk if you're an estimator at 6:30, 7 o'clock, and you are going to work until 5 o'clock. And that's not for everybody. But if you're clear on the expectations coming in and the company's clear in terms of hiring, then you can attract the right people and repel the wrong people. And so you've got to be able to be fundamentally clear on who you are as an organization, so you bring in the right people and make sure that you don't allow the wrong people to come into your organization. So a symptom of having a people problem is that you have the wrong people in your organization. And so let me give you a very simple framework that I'm always talking to my clients about. And this is for companies that are, 1 million in revenue all the way up to $1 billion in revenue. This is the question that you ask yourself. You're having a struggle with someone in your organization. It could be someone in the executive level. It could be a senior project manager, project executive, a foreman, a superintendent, all the way down to a laborer. If they walked in the door and they said to you, hey, I've got another position with a different company down the road, what would you do? If you would ask them to stay or to say, hold on a second, let's renegotiate, let's talk about this, then maybe they're the right person for your organization. But if you would say, hey, thanks for being here, have a nice day, that tells you that quite likely you have the wrong person in your organization, and you should address that at some point.
Yeah, I developed a rule of thumb 15 or 20 years ago. I found that if I ever thought about firing someone, like, wow, maybe I should get rid of this guy, or, maybe we should get rid of her. If I found myself thinking that, that was a red flag, because the best people on my team, I never thought about that. I always thought, wow, I can't imagine what it would be like if they left. So I think, yeah, that's a really good framework. And then to ask yourself, how often do I think about firing this person? And if the answer is more than zero, that's something you probably want to pay attention to. I want to go back to something you said about attracting and repelling people. I think most would say that makes perfect sense. We want to attract the right people, but repelling people, how do you go about repelling the wrong people for your organization?
It has to do with your interview process. So I was actually working with a GC yesterday, and they're, $500 million to $1 billion. They're having a really good year. So they're closer to $1 billion this year. And they're considering a particular position, a senior position in their organization, and they're considering 4 candidates for that position. So we've taken them through an assessment that I use with all of my clients. And that assessment can be used both as a coaching mechanism and as a hiring mechanism. And so we're looking at the way they think, the way they behave, and what they like to do in terms of the particular position that they're being considered for. And so one of the ways to attract the right people and repel the wrong people is to have a clear assessment that you can use, that you like, that makes sense, that works for you. And there's a bunch of different ones out there. I know the ones that I like. And you use that as part of the process, but that's only like a third of it, right? So a third of it is that assessment to give you some data. A third of it is their resume. Are they really able to do what they say they're able to do? And then a third of it is the interview process itself. And that's where you really have to have the right attitude. And I think the right attitude to have is that you are the prize. It is a privilege to work for you. And you shouldn't be begging people to come to work for you. Because if you're a good company, if you're doing great work for good clients, then it should be a privilege for someone to come and work for you. And you should have that attitude. And I know that's tough because labor is, there's a labor shortage. That's never going away. But the mindset that you should have for your company as you're growing and as you're bringing people in is that you're never going to settle. You're always looking for the right person in the right position. And yes, you may go and you may be on a project with your B team at times, just because that's the nature of the market. But I'm always going to be looking to upgrade my team, just like maybe a general manager of a sports team would always be saying, I know I've got to play the game on the schedule today, but for the next game and the next season and the next year, I'm going to always be looking to upgrade my team. So using assessments, having very aggressive, clear interview processes, being clear on the role and responsibility that you're looking to fill, that's really a great way to be able to attract, but then also repel the people that you don't want to have in your organization.
Yeah, good stuff. Let's talk about retaining people. I think this is an often overlooked area. There's a lot of talk about we need to get more people into the construction industry. We have this skilled labor shortage. There are hundreds of thousands of jobs that are unfilled. But last time I checked, there were 7 or 8 million people currently working in the construction industry.
Yes.
And in some cases, we have a retention problem. So what advice or what strategies have you found that will help with retention?
I think the most important thing is to have a clear career path for everyone in your organization. And this can be challenging, right? I know another company I'm working with at the moment, and one of their big challenges is that they have a whole clump of guys and gals who are in, let's say, their 30s, just their 30s. And you can just tell these are PMs, these are superintendents that could easily fill executive positions in the future. And there's a limited number of those executive positions. And so that's a challenge. But one of the things that you can do is really have a clear career path for everyone in your organization. And then you have to be thinking entrepreneurially as a company as well. If I want to retain this talent, then perhaps I need to expand my business in some way. There could be new types of projects that I get into, or new divisions that I open. And, these are big picture considerations. But as you're growing your company, if you're going to be in the game long term, and you are looking to grow your company, both in terms of the geographic scope or the project types or just the size of the company, then you should be thinking, okay, if I've got these talented people, where are they going to be 5-10 years from now if I'm going to be retaining them? So you've got to think strategically, and you've got to have a clear career path, and then you have to have clear communication with people. And that means sitting down with them and saying, and having the if-then conversations, right? If this happens, then this could be a career path for you. And you don't necessarily have guarantees, of course, but you have to have clear communication. And I think another thing that oftentimes we miss, that is a tremendous opportunity to retain people, is to use the strategy of tours of duty. And this depends on the size of your company in many cases, but perhaps you have someone who's working in project management and you want to develop them a little bit. And maybe you talk to them and say, hey, listen, why don't you take a year or two in estimating to get to know that part of the business a little bit more? Maybe in estimating and business development, so you can round yourself out a little bit. Or maybe if you're in project management, maybe in some cases, can you shift and be a superintendent and, get your boots on and go out into the field for a year or two to get a deeper appreciation of what's going on there? That can be another way to retain people, is to keep them actively involved in different parts of your company. But you've got to communicate. You can't just assume, and this one happens too, right? It's like, I'm just so glad that this guy's halfway decent. I'm just going to, leave him alone and let him do his thing. And then, a month later, some other company swooped in and, given him a sweetheart deal, and boom, off he goes.
Yeah. I worked inside Procter & Gamble about 15 years ago. And if you look at the career path of their brand managers, is what they were called at the time, the people that managed brands like Tide or Febreze or whatever their brand was, they moved through the different business segments. They all spent a time in sales and business development, some in finance and marketing, advertising, manufacturing. So they became well-rounded because they were thinking long-term. They were thinking strategically. And I've heard the same thing about Toyota as well. But I think you're exactly right. A lot of construction companies are thinking, they're living in the projects, thinking, all right, we just got to get through this project. And then look up, okay, good, they're still here. Woo, all right, made it through another tough project or a tough year, and then just living in the projects, but not thinking long-term, not thinking strategically. So yeah, I agree. And actually, I heard a statement in the last couple of months that people lose hope when they run out of future. So when they don't see a future in your organization, they don't see a future, and they lose hope, and then they become much more open to other opportunities, or maybe they go look for opportunities. So maybe you may have a really career, for those of you listening, you may have a clear path for your people in your head, but do they know it? So get it out of your head, have those conversations. Yeah.
And one other thing I would add, and this is a cliche, but I think it's true, is that people don't quit their companies, they quit their bosses. And so particularly if you have a company where, you're the CEO, and then you've got a layer of leadership underneath you, and then you've got the talent underneath them, you need to make sure that there aren't issues between your talented PMs or supers or foremen and the people who are leading them. You need to make sure that that's dialed in as well, because all of a sudden, one day, your project manager or executive comes in and say, hey, Joe just quit. And you're like, what? I thought Joe was solid. What happened there? And sometimes it could be a clash between them and the people they're reporting to.
So let's talk about that. This is something that's common with growing businesses. Here's a very specific situation. There's a business owner, and they have a superintendent who has reported directly to them for the last 10 years. The business grows, we put some structure in place, and let's say Steve is the business owner, and Steve inserts Mark as a director of operations to manage Bob, the superintendent. So suddenly there's this person who's in between the owner and the superintendent, and the dynamic has changed.
Yes.
What advice would you have for the owner in that case, who is bringing in someone to, I guess it could be interpreted as leapfrogging this long-time employee?
Yeah. So that's actually a really, really good question. I think, again, it comes down to communication. And what happens a lot of times in those situations is that you insert someone as the director of ops, but you don't clearly communicate to the people underneath them the chain of command and the chain of communication, how communication should happen. So what happens then is the superintendent is used to talking to you, and he spends all this time doing these end arounds. And because you're a good guy or a good gal and you've got an open door policy, you allow that to happen. And what you need to do is you need to sit down with the new person who's your director of ops, that layer of management, and the people in the field or the people who report to them, and clearly let them know, if you have an issue, this is the person you're going to go to. Now, having said that, it's always good to maintain relationships if you can. So you may need to take an extra effort to go grab a lunch with the superintendent from time to time, but communicate with the other person what you're doing so that they don't feel that somehow, you're having some, side conversations or something like that. And that can help you to, pick up on things that you may need to talk to the new person about, the person that you've inserted in leadership. But it's all about that communication and not letting the super do an end around. So when they do an end around to you, you got to say, hey, listen, you got to go talk to Steve about that. Go talk to Steve. Go talk to Steve.
Yeah, that's great advice, because if Steve realizes an end around play keeps being run around him, what's going to happen to Steve?
That's right.
So you've hired Steve, you've brought Steve in, and you have these great plans for Steve, and you've set Steve up as the director of operations. But if people are going around Steve, then Steve's not really sure what's going on. Steve loses some confidence. He doesn't have autonomy. He's hearing about things secondhand. He doesn't feel trusted. And it's very likely that you're going to lose Steve. Steve's certainly not going to be very effective and could very likely leave. So yeah, good advice. Yep. So let's talk about confidence. Let's talk about building confidence with your team. I've spent a lot of time working with construction teams, and owners will say things like, my team's just not confident. They get rolled over by customers. Something comes up, customer raises their voice a little bit, and they just tuck their tail and they give in, or trade partners are walking all over them and they just don't seem to be confident. My team doesn't seem to be confident. So how can a leader help their team, the people that they are managing, to be more confident?
Okay, so if I'm hearing you right, you're asking about confidence around potential conflict issues, such as with your clients or with trade partners and things like that.
Right. Yes.
Okay, so this is a very simple framework that I would encourage construction company owners and leaders to use, and I call it the ride around framework. And so it's really, really simple. So construction is full of conflict. And if you're not going to be able to handle conflicts with clients and project partners, you are not going to succeed. So let's assume that you are good at handling conflict, but your team could use some improvement and some more confidence. What I would have you to do is to have them come with you when you're going to have a conflict conversation with a project partner or with a client. Now, if you can do that in person, that's best. And have them observe you in that situation and see how you handle the situation, how you push back on the clients appropriately and the project partners. And then after observing you, break it down with them and have a conversation about what you were doing and what your intentions were and what your perspective was. And then if possible, the next time a conflict like that comes up, you go with them, but have them lead the conversation. And again, you've got to pick the right situation for this, but it's going to, because one of the challenging things is that you've got to let them go through it themselves without you swooping in like Superman to save the day, and observe them and see how they deal with the situation, and then afterwards break it down with them and give them your observations and how they could do a better job in the conflict. And then after that, have them do it by themselves and simply follow up with them and see how it goes. Now, this is not a quick fix kind of thing, right? This is not a magic pill, but this is a development process. Again, you do it with them watching you, they do it with you watching them, and then they do it alone with you following up with them. And as they're doing that, particularly in areas of conflict, they can then build their confidence, because the only way to build confidence is by building competence. And the only way to build competence is by actually doing the thing that you're not confident about.
Yeah, I think that's a misconception, is people, they think that when they'll develop competence when they have confidence, or they wait to try it until they have confidence. And the reality is you have to do it. You have to get some reps in and make some mistakes, and then you'll develop confidence by doing it. But confidence follows action, not the other way around. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good framework.
And just to make another note there, and I think this is critical, is how you as a leader handle the failures of your people. And there's a couple of different types of failure, right? There's character failures, which to me are more severe than, let's say, a process failure or a failure related to competency or experience. And so if there's a character issue with someone, like if they lie to a client or if they lie to me, I'm going to be way more concerned with that than if they just made a mistake or, got rolled over a little bit on a negotiation and they need to learn. And what I want to do as a leader is let them know, because some people, you know what they're like when they make a mistake, they beat themselves up. They never want to do it again, all those kinds of things. So I need to let them know that failure is okay as long as we're learning from that failure. And certain types of failure are not acceptable. If you lie, if you cheat, if you steal, that's not acceptable. We're not going to allow that. But other types of failure we'll work with as long as you're learning from that failure.
Yeah. While we're on the subject of failure, how has a failure or apparent failure in your career set you up for later success? Or do you have a favorite failure of yours?
Yeah, my favorite failure has to be the one and only time I've gotten fired in my life. I started working with contractors back in 2004. I was selling a leadership program, and my first client was a contractor, and they're still my client today. But when the recession hit in 2008, I was selling sort of like this big leadership package, and, contractors stopped buying a big leadership package, when the Great Recession hit. And so that run, so to speak, ended for me. I was working with a guy as an independent contractor, and I went to work for another company in a completely different industry. And I did it because, I always wanted to start my own business, but I did it because at the time I had a wife, had a bunch of small kids, and dude, I needed a paycheck. And dude, it was a terrible mistake on my part. And I sucked at this job. I sucked. And it was classic, right? Because if I was the one leading the company, I would have fired me 6 months earlier. The guy was super nice. It had nothing to do with the company. It was a fine company. But he came to me one day and he said, Eric, it was a Friday. It was hey, Eric, can you bring your laptop to lunch conversation? So I bought my laptop. I knew what was going to happen. I brought my laptop to lunch. We shook hands and parted friends, but I got fired. So that was Friday. Monday, I started my business. That was back in 2013. I started my business. I finally, got the entrepreneurial courage that I needed. And so from that failure came the business that I'm running now. And, I couldn't be more happy with the decision that I made.
I had a similar experience. I was fired, let's see, 1, 2. The third time was questionable, but getting fired twice, maybe a third time. The third time really depends on who you ask, I guess. But it was clear I was fired twice. Once with plenty of warning. It was 2010. I was working on a large project that had launched just I was in July of 2007, just before everything crashed. So we had to finish that project out. But I knew that was coming. And then the second time I was fired was on a Friday afternoon with a phone call that was, Todd, I'm here with human resources, or with whomever from HR. And I thought, oh, this can't be good.
Nope.
And your position is being eliminated. And I thought, okay, when? How much time? And they said, as soon as we hang up the phone. And it wasn't a bring your laptop to lunch because they were in St. Louis. It was pack everything up, put it in a box, and ship it to us. And
oh, wow.
The phone was shut off immediately. It was very unceremonious. If I'd been local, it would have been like being escorted out of the building by security. Yep. It was sort of like that. Yep. And those, looking, at the time, that it wasn't like I was saying this is going to be the defining moment of my life. It was, oh, this is scary. I have small children, suddenly unemployed. And for the second time, it was like, damn, I just got fired twice. And this is in like 6 months. Like, what's going on? You talk about rattling your confidence. But looking back on it, it was the path where I needed to be. And then I wouldn't be where I am today. So it's sometimes getting fired can be a good thing. Otherwise, you may stay there in that mediocre job just because neither you nor your boss has the guts to do what needs to be done and get you out of there. Yeah.
And I think what's interesting there is that if you run a company and you are allowing people in your company that aren't a fit, you're doing a disservice not only to yourself, but you're doing a disservice to them.
Yeah. And
you're actually helping them by not allowing them to stay in the company.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I thought a lot about failure over the past couple of years, and I've asked that same question to a lot of people. Tell me about your favorite failure. And I realized that failure is, it's a myth. Failure doesn't really exist because every person I've talked to has gone on from that failure. No one is still unemployed 8, 10, 12 months later. None of them just stayed on the ground. They all picked themselves up. They went to something else. And in many cases, that apparent failure set them up for later success. So I heard a story back during COVID. There was a couple who sold everything. They were in Italy, I think, and they sold all of their possessions during COVID. Got on a sailboat, and they were going to sail to the edge of the earth. They were flat earthers. So nice. No offense to any flat earthers out there. But so it turned out that where they thought the edge of the earth was going to be just wasn't there. There was just more ocean, and they hit a storm, lost their boat. They washed up on the shore of some other country, and they were promptly arrested because it was during COVID and Europe was under lockdown, and these people were out sailing around trying to find the edge of the earth. So they ended up in prison, all because they believed a myth that there was the edge of the earth. And I think a lot of people believe in the myth of failure. We're so scared of this thing of failure that doesn't exist. And if you look at the really successful people, they've all gone through what would seem to be failure at one point or the other, and they just kept going. So I think a lot of us are scared of something that just doesn't really exist. It's like the edge of the earth. When you get to what you think is failure, there's a lot more life on the other side of it, and it could actually be, instead of a setback, it could be a setup.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think part of that also is, for some of us, we struggle with how other people perceive us. Yeah. And we think, if I fail, what are other people going to think? And, really, it's like this. I think about high school, right? When we were in high school, we were so concerned about how we looked. But you know what, dude? Most people are just obsessed about how they look. They're not thinking about you. They're thinking about themselves. Yeah. And so if you fail, I doubt that a ton of people are going to be pointing their fingers at you and laughing. I think it's time for you to, stand up and keep moving forward, like you said, Todd.
Yeah. They're not thinking about you.
Yes.
They're thinking about themselves. So
Yeah.
I think a lot of the head games we play with ourselves are the root cause of a lot of our problems. So let's talk about meetings.
Yes.
I've been in spent thousands of hours in meetings, very few of which I felt were effective. When I was in a good meeting and somebody was facilitating a good meeting, I was like, wow, this is a unicorn. I need to capture this person. We need to take them into a lab. We need to study them because they have some secret sauce that most people do not. So I read where you said there are some specific steps you need to take to make sure your construction team meetings are not only like functional, but fast, functional, and fun. So what are those steps and why do they work?
That's a great question. I'm thinking specifically of the types of meetings where, as a project team or a company team, you have a specific problem that you've identified that you need to work on. In that environment, what happens many times is that leaders of construction companies get frustrated because they can never seem to get their team to come to a clear agreement, or they themselves struggle with facilitation. And so they think either my team sucks or I suck. And my conviction is that neither of those statements are true. The problem is the structure of your meeting. And this is specifically when it comes to solving problems. So the first thing you need to do is identify the problem clearly. And the way you do that in your business is by numbers or metrics, and then conversations. Metrics tell you part of the story, but then you have to conversate around the metric. And this is in advance of the meeting so that you can clearly identify the problem. Once you've clearly identified the problem, you then gather the team that are going to work on solving the problem. And in this particular type of meeting, you don't want to have too few people in the meeting, but you don't want to have too many. So in my experience, usually between 6 and 8 people in a meeting like this is a good number. And then you have to have a diverse group as well. So if you're dealing with a big picture item, let's say you're dealing with a project issue that is reoccurring in your company from project to project. And your instinct might be to bring in, your project executives, your superintendents. You may also want to bring in people from your accounting side and even your business development side to get some diverse perspectives on the problem, because perhaps the root cause isn't necessarily in the field, it's somewhere else in your business. Okay, so you identify the problem, you gather the team, then you must make the rules for the meeting. And I have 3 ground rules for any meeting that I facilitate or I teach my clients to facilitate. The first one is everyone participates. If you're invited, there's no courtesy invites. You're there for a reason. You're there to participate. So no hiding in the corner. Number 2, no distractions. That means you put down the crack pipe, right? No one's on their phones. No one's on their computers. We're going to be completely focused for this time. And then number 3 is no clowning. And what I mean by that is there's no bad ideas in the meeting. So I'm not there to critique other people's ideas, particularly in the initial idea generation phase. There's no bad ideas. I just want the ideas expressed and considered. Okay. Then what I want to do is I want to generate ideas. So I frame the problem well. So this is an example. Let's say I'm struggling with safety on my projects. So the way that I would frame that is, in what specific ways can we improve safety in our organization in the next 90 days? So you have a particular issue, safety. You have a time frame for improvement, 90 days. And then the key word there is specific. Because the more specific you can be, the more actionable you can be. Okay. So once I've got the problem framed well, I'll put it on a whiteboard, or if I'm in a Zoom meeting, you'll put it on the top of a Word document so everyone can see it, or on a flip chart, whatever the case is. Then you give everyone 2 minutes to generate as many ideas as they can come up with in 2 minutes to solve that problem. There's no bad ideas. It's what I call green light thinking. Once they've generated those ideas, typically most people will generate 4 to 6 ideas. If they only generate 1 or 2, that's perfectly fine. You then ask them to pick your top 2 ideas of the list that you've generated. Then you're going to go around the room. And as the facilitator, let's say you're the company leader and you're facilitating the meeting. You start with one person and you get their first idea. Only one idea, not 2. You make sure it's clear. You ask clarifying questions. You write the idea on the board or on the flip chart, or you type it in on your document. If you need someone to help you with the typing, get someone to do that. Okay. Then you go around the room, get everyone's first idea, and you have the senior leaders go last. And you, if you're going to give your idea, you definitely go last. Then you go back around the room the other way and get everyone's second idea. So everyone gets a chance to weigh in. They get a chance to share their ideas. You'll find that sometimes people have duplicate ideas. You then ask them to share their next idea. So if you have 6 to 8 people in the room, you'll generate a list of ideas, typically from 12 to 15 ideas. Now, we all know that a problem with meetings is when all is said and done, a lot was said and nothing is done. So you have a list of those ideas, you need to prioritize them. And the simple way to prioritize them is to take a third of those ideas and distribute votes. So if you have 15 ideas, you would distribute 5 votes to every person in the meeting. You then ask them to pick their top 5 ideas. They can't stack their votes. They must distribute them over 5 ideas. Now, I learned this process in 2004. I've built my entire business on teaching this process and facilitating this process. As you use this process, you will typically get 2 to 3 ideas that surface as the best ideas. And 80% of the time, you'll get one idea that's the clear winner. Okay? Then you look everyone in the eye and you ask them this. This is the number 1 idea. By a show of hands, if we committed in the next 90 days to executing on this idea, so let's say for safety, we're going to have a tailgate meeting every single day, right? For 5 to 10 minutes. If we executed on this idea in the next 90 days, how many people would support that by a show of hands? And I promise you, in 99% of the time, if you've run this process right, you'll get unanimous consensus and agreement to pursue that idea. And if you don't get unanimous agreement, it's because something is unclear in someone's mind and you need clarity there. You following that so far?
Yep,
okay.
Good stuff.
And then you just build a plan around that. You've got to build the plan at the end, okay? So you've got to get your rally cry. What is it that we're trying to, maybe your rally cry in this case would be tailgate meeting. And then you get areas of action with people specifically accountable to execute on those areas of action. And then you get metrics that are tracking those areas of action that you can hold people accountable for. And if you run this process right, you can go from a blank piece of paper to unanimous agreement and an action plan in about an hour.
Yeah. And the underlying part of that is that the team has developed the plan and they've been part of developing the plan. They've agreed on what the problem is. They've agreed on what the action plan is. And they are, in my experience, they'll be much more likely to follow through on it. And what's interesting, what I found is that you could go into you or I could go into our cave of our fortress of solitude and come up with the exact same action plan and hand it off to the team, and they will actively resist the plan that we came up with them or for them, whereas they'll run through walls to implement the plan that they were part of developing. Have you seen the same thing?
100%. Yeah. I completely agree with you there, Todd. Yep. When people get a chance to weigh in, then they can buy in, and they will work much harder for their ideas than your ideas.
Yeah, it took me a long time to figure that out. I wish I had figured that out about 15 years earlier in my career, but that is the secret sauce of implementation. If you want to implement meaningful change, if you want to see changed behavior, you have to get people to buy into it, and they need to be part of developing the process. It's really not about the plan. It's about who is involved with developing the plan, and that is often overlooked. Yeah, great stuff. I love that process. Couple of favorite questions. One more of my favorite questions is, what is something you believe to be true about business that some may think is unconventional or maybe even a little crazy?
Retirement is overrated.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do you mean?
Well, we have this mindset in the United States, particularly, that, you work until you're whatever, 50, 60, and then you retire. For some people, that's cool. That's fine. I understand, dude. If you've been working in the field for 40 years, you're like, I'm done, Eric. I'm done. But for many of us, I think retirement is overrated. And the way that I look at my business, the way I know that many of my clients look at their businesses, is that it's a vocation. It's not just a job, or it's not just a business, but this is who I am. This is an integral part of my identity. And therefore, it's something I'm going to be doing as long as I am capable of doing it. And my capability and capacity may change as I age. I may grow in my wisdom, but in my energy level, that may decline a little bit. That's just a natural part of life. But as far as I'm concerned, if you want to retire, go ahead. But retirement is not essential. And so one of the things that you can be thinking about as a construction company owner is that if that's something that you buy into, how does that look like for you as you go forward in terms of the way that you run your business? But how might it look for other people who work in your business? So perhaps you have a guy or a gal who's been with you for 20, 30 years, and they are at that retirement age, but they don't necessarily want to retire. Do I boot them out the door anyway? Or perhaps do I find a role for them that maybe isn't full-time, but is still a role where I can tap into their experience and their wisdom, and they can still make a contribution in my organization?
I like that. I think a lot of people want to retire, but they don't really think about what's on the other side of that, or they put happiness on the other side of retirement. And I know of a lot of people who have spent 10, 20, 30 years thinking, I'll be happy when I retire, only to find out that they're not happy. And that's pretty disappointing and frustrating, to work towards something for decades only to find out it wasn't there. So good advice. All right. You've written a new book called, let's talk about your book. What's your book called? And tell us why you wrote the book, what it covers, and why folks may want to go check it out.
Yeah, the book has a very simple title. It's Construction Genius. And it's effective, hands-on, practical, simple, no BS leadership, strategy, sales, and marketing advice for construction companies. So we start with leadership, we go on to strategy, and then we cover sales and marketing. And I actually got that title, the effective, hands-on, practical, simple, no BS. I got that from one of my clients who was reviewing one of the leadership courses that they went through. And they said, Eric's stuff is effective, hands-on, practical, simple, no BS.
It's good. It's always good to just grab marketing copy straight from the mouth of your clients.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. And it's funny. Often I get the question about the name of my company and my book, Construction Genius, and so people look at me and and they say, "So you're the genius?" And I tell them that I get the name of my company from the Thomas Edison quote that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. So the way I look at it is that my clients and the folks who are in construction, they're the actual geniuses. They give the 99%, and I'm there just to help them with that 1% of inspiration and direction.
Yeah. So talk about your podcast a little bit. It's the Construction Genius podcast. What are some of the topics that you cover on there?
Yeah, we cover leadership, strategy, sales, and marketing. And so I have, folks from the industry come on, CEOs of construction companies. I do solo shows where I'll share particular topics on people development, some of the stuff that we've talked about. And then I'll also have outside of the industry, like, industry partners come on. I've actually got a whole series of podcasts, if you search for them, with people who, with technology folks. And if you listen to those podcasts, you'll get a whole primer on how to implement technology effectively in your organization. And so those are really, really good episodes to check out as well.
Good stuff.
Yep.
So if people want to find out more about you, listen to your stuff, connect with you, where are some of the best places for them to go?
I think the best place would be to check out my podcast or my book. Those are simple. The podcast is free and the book's $20. Those are great ways to check me out. You can go to my website, constructiongenius.com, and you can find links to my book, my podcast, and my blog all there. You can also go to constructiongeniusbook.com and easily, check out the book and then go and grab yourself a copy in Kindle, audio, hardcover, or paperback on Amazon.
Good stuff. Well, Eric Anderton from Construction Genius, thanks for taking the time to be on here, and thanks for the work you're doing.
I appreciate it. Just want to let you know, Todd, is that you've actually been an inspiration for me when you started your podcast before mine, and it was a big leap for me. But I saw that you were consistently showing up with tremendous content, and so I just want to thank you for being an inspiration to me.
I appreciate that. It means a lot. Thanks, Eric.
All right, thank you.